Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, whatever time of day you are listening to this. Welcome to the Joygasmic Life Podcast.
Right where you are right in this moment is exactly where you are meant to be. So, wherever that may be, just be.
To be a new you.
Your permission slip to raise your standards and live an even more amazing life. Now, if you're feeling like that's way out of the ball game and you're really suffering with like pain in your body, guilt, shame, anxiety, depression, like these emotions run a lot of people's lives, and that's not by accident. Our culture is set up to keep us in those emotions because it's easier to control people when they're in those emotions. But if you're on an awakening journey and you have recognized that those are there, you have taken the most crucial step to get out of that, which is to become aware that it's actually happening.
It's time to awaken, to bring all the parts of yourself back. Welcome. Explore the joy
to this journey.
Live your life. Thank you. You live full out, fully expressed, fully harnessing the joygasmic potential of your body and yourself. Anything is possible. And especially we are here to tell you that deep and fulfilling love is possible and is available for you when you choose it for yourself.
Please forgive me. I love you. Thank you.
Welcome, Keli Garza. So glad to have you here. And it's funny to start here because we've just had such a lovely about our morning smoothies. And yours is simple, mine is complex. It's beautiful. So I just wanted to welcome you officially to the Joygasmic Life Podcast, and I'm so glad to meet you because I met you many years ago through your videos and through your training course on vaginal steaming. I watched your video with Indie Birth and was like, oh wow, I need to study this. I need to know this because I used to have really crappy periods and then they sort of resolved, and I was looking at preconception and how to work with the body to make sure I was doing absolutely the best things I could do in terms of that preconception. And when steaming showed up, I was like, ancient traditional knowledge. I am thirsty. I am hungry. Gimme. And so I just dived right in. I did your initial practitioner course, which was so much, and really loved that. And so it's really it's an honor for me today to get to talk to you because I've studied with you a bunch, and it's great that we got to meet each other just now.
Look, I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much. These conversations are so important. It is how people hear about steaming. I think a podcast gives us a long enough time, and these conversations are so important. And I'm just honored to be here and to finally be able to meet you and have a conversation and hear what your experiences have been, especially since your postpartum.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. The postpartum experience of steaming was, it was interesting because I only got to steam a little bit before I got pregnant, right? You talk in your course around the perfect period being 4 days long, bright red from start to finish. And when I encountered that work, I was like, oh, my period is 2.5 to 3 days long and brown and kind of stringy and kind of absent-ish. Am I okay? Yeah. Right? I had sort of been grateful my period was short and not really a big deal. But then when I heard that, I was like, oh. And then it was only 3 months of steaming before my period was that perfect period. And I was like, oh, that's great. That was so effective. And then it was only 3 more months after that before I was pregnant. And so it was really interesting because I fell in love with steaming and then couldn't steam for 9 months while I was gestating a baby. And so I was really looking forward to it. I got to the end of that, and I worked with a practitioner who was helping with sort of that end of pregnancy, sort of labor steaming, and giving me advice and wisdom on that, which was just mind blowing because I unfortunately had a hemorrhoid in week 39. and was like, oh my God, this is the worst thing. I'd never experienced that before in my life. It was like the worst. And I was like, I'm going to labor like this. Like, I'm going to live like this for how long? I don't know. And then I was like, oh, maybe I can steam this away. And it was like literally one steam and it was gone and it didn't come back and it never came back.
I love that story.
Right? And I was like, oh, this shit is magical. Like, I was like, what? Because hemorrhoids is such an issue for so much, such a silent, unspoken about issue for so many women at the end of pregnancy. And so it was like, oh, I've got a tool now. I've got a tool for that. It's so good. And yeah, so just that whole journey. And then I got to do my 40 days steaming postpartum and really figure out like a nice little system with that. And I did have some fairly major tearing, sort of like 3-way split of my yoni, whoop, opening up as the baby came through, and was really like so glad to know that I had steaming on my side in terms of the healing of that for sure. And it felt really nourishing all through that process. Yeah. So
Wow.
that was, yeah, that's a bit of a woo, but
You've used it for so many different things. So then you steamed for 40 days postpartum?
yeah, 40 and then like on and off as I felt like it after that. But like really dedicatedly for that 40 days postpartum to get that
cool.
full uterine cleanse. And
yeah. Did you end up with scar tissue?
Yeah, I would say still working with scar tissue up until maybe 7 or 8 months postpartum, just with like castor oil and self-massage and doing steaming and stuff like that. And there was a piece that I feel really called to share, which is because the steaming helps heal and like close those wounds so quickly. I made I started steaming before I had really analyzed what had happened. Right. I was like, oh my God, that was so intense. And I know that steaming will help, but I didn't check in with what had actually happened. Right. I just went, keep my leg, I don't care. Keep my legs together, just steam with my legs together. It'll be fine. La, 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 la. Right. So it wasn't until maybe, I think it was like 7 or 8 days into steaming that I finally was like, okay, let's get the mirror out. And like, I had asked my husband to look and he goes, oh yeah, looks fine. Like, I'm like, yeah, okay. But actually like, I should have looked, right? Like he goes, oh, it looks fine. I should have looked. So when I looked, what I realized is that I had, like the labia had gone like this and one of them had come together nicely, but the other one, these pieces had closed up apart from each other before, like, because the steaming was like, oh, let's just heal those up. I hadn't pulled them together before they healed, right? So these ones had done that naturally, these ones had not. And so at that point I was like, oh, like I'm not getting those back together. They're just like that from now on. And so I feel a bit of a passion to be like, hey, like you need to look and see what's going on, and either utilizing people talk about doing kombu or nori. I would recommend actually, because it's like easier to work with. The kombu is really like rubbery to like hold those pieces together. But like I just was like, we'll see what happens. And I do kind of believe that women's vaginas are meant to go and then close back up, and it's like it hasn't caused challenges. Mm-hmm. Every once in a while I go like, oh, that's tugging a bit funny. And I kind of wish like I had done that looking. So that's why I go like, hey, if you're going to do steaming postpartum, make sure that you're like bringing all the pieces together before you start steaming, because otherwise they can do that. So yeah, wow.
Wow, that is really, really interesting. Really fascinating. I mean, like I think what's so cool about every steam, experience is that it's so different, I think, like that's the thing about, I mean, when you think about like what can happen, like when you give birth, like so many things can happen from pregnancy to giving birth and etc. It's just like from menstrual cycles, like the variation of menstrual cycles is insane, like how different, and how many different things could be happening. So it's fascinating. And ultimately it's all like kind of in the area of what society considers taboo. So we don't talk enough about it. So I've never even heard of that. Like, what?
Right.
Like, that's insane. And I wouldn't have even thought about that with the steaming. So that makes sense. And I guess this is a home birth.
Yeah.
And in a hospital setting, you would have been sutured up.
Yeah, which is what happened.
So it's something to think about, like, is having a way to pull that together, even if you're not, going to use like sutures or something. But it sounds like you already even know like the possibilities of what you could have used. That's really cool.
Yeah, a bit of a research nerd. So yeah, I had definitely thought about it. But actually, the interesting thing is that the emotional journey to actually be able to like look at and tackle that, right, took me some days. And then the journey of actually going like, oh, and then I can do something about that is like, oh, it took me a while. And I hear that a lot from women. It's like, oh, they go like, I had my baby, forget my vagina, it's not important, I'll just deal with that later. And then they have stuff like prolapse, they have stuff like long-term bleeding, that you go over in your course in really great ways. Like my mind was blown with some of your case studies where you're talking about like people having bleeding on and off for 9 months postpartum and just being like, oh yeah, that's just how my life is now. You go like, what? Like,
me too.
What?
I tell you, I'm like, what's going on here? Like, I think this like lack of knowledge and lack of discussion around it, like, and I don't put it on like women, all the way, like, like women are functioning in what James Brown calls a man's world, right? Like we're functioning in a man's world where it's not like we're supposed to talk about periods at work or at school. Like we've been taught and trained and conditioned not to, and then the same with postpartum and the same with miscarriage. Like, like I think working with miscarriage has been fascinating to me because it's like my conception of a miscarriage, nobody talks about it, right? So it's like, it was fascinating to me that they could be going on for 2 or 3 weeks and, it's just all this, or even like, it could be a year later and somebody hasn't even passed the pregnancy matter. And, you learn all this stuff. And I just realized that there's just this, like, this deafening silence around like what is even possible. And so I'll share with you, I actually postpartum, I had a prolapse and I was terrified and I was also scared. And I was scared to look. I was scared to know what it was. And I did the same thing you did, was I just steamed. And luckily the prolapse went away. Yeah. And so, the prolapse resolved and some of the skin swelling went down. So it started to feel more normal very immediately. But I don't blame you for that response. Let me steam and look later and just start to get things going, because I think when I really think about why was I so scared, like the first time I went to the bathroom, I think it was because it was a complete unknown area. Had somebody educated me, okay, these are some of the things that you might encounter postpartum, for me it was the prolapse, like the whole, I didn't know that your uterus could come out. Like your uterus could come right out, right? It could follow the baby right out. You know what I mean? Like,
whoa, yeah.
That seems like it should be, for the amount of babies people are having, you know what I mean? Like, it seems like you should at some point realize or know that that's a possibility. And I think had I known what it was, then I wouldn't have been as afraid. I think I was really afraid because I knew that something was really wrong.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what that meant, Yeah.
Yeah. And it's freaky to think about organs falling out, and like Western medical's solution to that is like, let's like chop them out and like suture you to your body, right? Like let's suture your cervix to your tailbone. And you're like, that is not a solution. That is not a long-term solution when you could like sit over a steam pot for like 30 days and maybe completely resolve it in the first 5, like everybody's body is different. Depends on how dedicated you are to it and what happens, but like let's just snip it and sew it in there. And you're like, no, like that causes so many troubles down the road. Like,
no Frankenstein on me, please.
Right? Oh my gosh. And then like also just like on a little like tangent about things that are unknown that people don't talk about is like the hysterectomy rate for women 65 and over is something like 70%. no, don't quote me, right? My brain, and I'm not a statistician, but it was like a shockingly high number. And how many of those are happening as part of the birthing process without consent? It's just like crazy. Anyway, I have a big, like, I've got a big chip on my shoulder about Western medical because of stuff like that. You hear stories like that and you're just like, that's not okay. Like, when we could be doing really simple things that are like low, no cost, that we can do at home, that we can like self-manage, that resolve so many of those issues, you know? And that's part of why I got so stoked about steaming. I was like, you could probably just solve all of the gynecological issues with this, like, or at least put a good like step forward with it, right?
Listen, I haven't said it in a while, but to me, steaming is like a gynecologist in a box. Like anything that somebody goes to the gynecologist for, like you can, there seems to be a way that steaming can also, help resolve it, like in a natural way, without any, cutting or drugs,
Yeah. I'm curious about your thoughts about, like, I heard this term a lot in my pregnancy, was like pathogenic cold in the womb, and how steaming impacts that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I believe that's a concept from like traditional Asian medicine. Yeah. They, and I don't actually talk about cold that much. What I usually just equate it to stagnation. Ultimately, when the body gets cold, it gets stiff, right? It gets stagnant. And so when you think about the body, anywhere in the body, if the body gets too cold, it's going to get stagnant to the point that it's not going to be functioning in the same way, right? And the circulation isn't going to that area. And so that's basically the problem. And so in traditional Asian medicine, they have this, they can basically diagnose somebody, okay, this uterus is cold, which makes sense. And so ultimately what happens if somebody has a cold uterus, or what the effect is that they're not getting as much stagnation to the uterus, and then the uterus can't perform its own functions the way that it needs to. And we need the uterus to perform its functions, right? It's in charge of more than just childbirth, which, one of the reasons why that hysterectomy rate is so high is because Western medicine only considers the importance of the womb compared to its role, or related to its role of childbearing. But uterus is in charge of our hormone system. There's a feedback system between the uterus and our brain. Some of our hormones are actually produced in the ovaries, which is when they do hysterectomies, a lot of times they try to keep the ovaries because of that reason. So, this is like, and not only that, like the uterine wall and the vaginal canal, walls are part of the feedback loop, for those hormones that are created in the ovaries and then communicated up to the brain. I mean, it's a whole thing, and I'm not an expert in it, but like, I understand, that this is going on, and that this uterus is very important outside of just childbearing, right? Because if our hormones impact our emotions, I mean, that's your life, right? Like your emotions.
Like, any woman knows that your hormones impact your
right?
your emotions. That's just like
right. This has to do with how you're living day to day, and this is determined largely by our endocrine system, by our hormones, right? So the fact that the uterus, it's important for the uterus to have proper blood flow and proper blood circulation. And steaming, for all of its benefits, people ask, well, how does it work and why does it work? And if you want to look at it from like a scientific point of view, the reality is it hasn't been studied from a scientific point of view. But what we do know is that heat increases circulation. And so even if the heat, people think that the steaming doesn't get all the way into the uterus or up the vaginal canal or into the cervix, even if it doesn't. Okay. I think we have anecdotal evidence it does, but even if it doesn't, it touches the vulva, and the vulva has, uterine vessels that connect to the vaginal canal, that connect to the uterus, that connect to the fallopian tubes and the ovaries.
And the central nervous system, right? And the vagus nerve, right? All of that.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. You're gonna go deeper? You want to go further? Okay.
I want to talk about the vagus nerve. Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Okay, you're gonna have to go there with it. But like the reality is, you're impacting. Then there's 16 ligaments that are holding the uterus into place. So now you've also impacted those ligaments. So just improving circulation relaxing the musculature, all of the muscles that are in that area. So you've relaxed the muscles, you've toned the ligaments, you've increased circulation to the entire uterus. So if nothing else, just that circulation hitting the vulva is going to improve the body's own ability to do what it was doing, to do what it's supposed to do. So if there are any, if there was any stagnation issues, if there are any hormonal imbalances, then you're optimizing the uterus's ability to do its own functions.
Yeah, beautiful. And if we think about heat transfer, right? It's like a pot is hot where the flame is, but the whole pot gets warm, right? The water inside the pot gets warm.
Yes.
Right? It's like,
yes. That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. And then I like also the other thing that Kimberly, one of my friends, Kimberly Johnson, was mentioning, who's a somatic practitioner, experiencing practitioner, is that the freeze state that people go into. When you think of freeze, we're also talking about cold. You brought up cold. Cold. So when you think about a freeze state that happens due to trauma, or something, or whatever trigger, steaming, heat is the opposite. When something's frozen and you want it not to be frozen, you would heat it up, you would melt it, right? Yeah. And so steam also has that kind of effect. And that's the other thing that I was thinking of when you said cold uterus. So you have a cold uterus, you're going to increase the circulation through heat. And then if you have if somebody's in a frozen state, in a freeze state, due to trauma, it also can thaw out the person from that freeze state and get movement going again.
Yeah, I sometimes talk about steaming your rapist out of your vagina when I work with people.
Oh, okay.
Right? In terms of trauma response.
Say it how it is. Let's just say it how it is.
Because one of the things that I really love about the intake process that you trained us in is how many questions there are about people's sexual history and their reproductive history. And people can fill out that questionnaire ahead of time, but when you go through it with them, you get all sorts of stories, and you go oh, your uterine challenges might have something to do with this really challenging experience that happened in your past. And it doesn't necessarily, because of the taboo and because of the silence and because of the freeze and because of all of that, we don't necessarily think about it that way. But as a practitioner, when you're walking through that with people, it's even having the opportunity to talk about your gynecological concerns with somebody who's not going to try and cut you open is a healing process for people, right? Or some of the work that I do is around sexual trauma healing, and it's
wow, talk about a safe space. You're right. How are we supposed to talk about gynecological issues to a surgeon? Wow. Okay. I love you, Elena. Making a lot of sense to me.
I just try and say it how I see it, and I understand how I see it isn't for everybody, but for me it makes a lot of sense. It's yeah.
Look, we're not for everybody, but it is important that we just sit down and talk to each other every once in a while, because I get it. Yeah, so you work with sexual trauma, you mentioned. Yeah, what I find fascinating is how much I think that steaming is really important when you look at, for example, the Me Too movement that happened a couple of years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody was Me Too, let's expose all of this violence, that's been occurring. Let's maybe stop, keeping it quiet. And I think that is so important, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also so triggering, right? And also so vulnerable, because then people can dismiss it. They can make, they can completely, say and do things very inappropriate, around that type of sharing, And so I saw this moment where all of a sudden, everybody was sharing these stories and these experiences. But what I was oh no, but you got to steam now, right? Ultimately, it was there's something important in exposing it, but exposing it is very different than helping that person to move on from it, or to address some of the impacts it's had on their life. So like when you look at, look, I don't know, none of this was on the question list. Like these were not the topics we're supposed to be talking about, but listen, we'll talk about what we need to talk about because this is where we've gone, right? But like when I look at the physiological effects of sexual trauma, and I'm talking about from like, I'm looking at people's menstrual cycles, right? Yeah. And so it started to come up because somebody had a missing period, and it was missing from when she got raped 9 months ago, right? So ultimately, you can't talk about the menstrual cycle without talking about sexual trauma. Somebody else had horrible cramps from the time that she was raped, right? Somebody else, right, has horrible infections that started when they started getting molested, right? Like ultimately, there's these physiological things that when you're looking at somebody's intake form, this person knows exactly when it started, and it had to do with sexual abuse, right? And so it's like, when I think about all the things that happen, like sadly, very few of us in this world have escaped it, right? But when I think about what happens after you're raped, when I walk through what happened with me after, it leaves a lot to be desired. But there is
compassion from others, in terms of empathy, in terms of like healing work, like
yes,
all
you
of
have
that
pats
is missing.
on the back. You have forensics. So are you going to do a criminal report or not? You can have a gynecological exam related to the forensic report, and you can have therapy. And what they offer in therapy is nothing more than, at least in my case, antidepressants.
Right. Yeah. And that's not care. That's not caring. That's analyzing.
And what was really interesting is I remember everybody's like, don't shower. So I did a forensic exam, and I had to go for a really long time without showering. So I had this scent on me, I was in the police report. I was in the police office sitting there with the scent on me, right? I had to go through all of these steps. And then finally it was like, okay, you can shower. And I would say it was maybe 12 to 14 hours later after the event had occurred, right? And it's like, so then I could go shower. And I remember that shower was everything. Like that shower was so relieving, right? But think about all this time, like, and then the next day I got to go to, a therapist, and she offered me antidepressants, right? So it's just like, that was all that was given. Did it impact my period? Yes, it did. Did it impact the way that I smelled? Yes. Like probably until my next period, which went missing, I had that scent, on me, right? Which is triggering you at every moment, right? So you think about like, and then, so people's periods go missing, or sometimes they get violent cramps after a sexual abuse, or sometimes they get infections. And then sometimes they have ongoing bleeding, like they have bleeding that they cannot get to stop, or really heavy bleeding afterwards. And again, they'll tie this to, I never had this until this happened, right? They can tie it to a specific event, right? Yeah. But it's just periods, right? There are people who have periods like this who can't tie it to an event, like, or that wasn't, a specific event like that. But to me, unless you've healed from the physiological abuse, unless you've addressed like the menstrual cycle and helped resolve those physiological effects that are now with that person as a result of that act of violence, how can that person actually move on? They didn't have infections, and now they have infections every time they have sex with a loving partner. How can they move on? Like ultimately it's still with them. So that was what I was really kind of happened real early on, was like, you can't like, when it comes to recovering from sexual abuse, what's really missing is a physiological element where we're helping the person, I don't want to say victim, but when we're helping the I don't know, what word do I use? We're helping the victim.
Recipient? No, that's not a good word.
It doesn't sound right.
Nope. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but
the person who was raped. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
like
who,
that
the person who was
person.
sexually abused. Yeah.
Yeah, like we have to, in order to move on from trauma, we have to address the physiological impacts of that
Yeah.
trauma to our menstrual cycles.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and the vagus nerve, right? Because we were like, or the vagus nerve earlier, you were really excited about that. I think it ties in really nicely.
I like it because there are people like you who know a lot about it, and I love to hear your guys' explanation of the vagus nerve. I'm not actually an anatomy nerd. I only learned like as much as anatomy as I need to. But yes, like the vagus nerve, it has to do with relaxation, right? It has to do with.
Yeah, so my understanding is the vagus nerve is like, we have our central nervous system. It's got the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. One is responsible for fight or flight. The other is responsible for feed and breed. The vagus nerve is sort of like the central channel that's responsible for that homeostasis, the feed and breed, the relaxation, that kind of thing. And when it's disrupted through like an intense act of trauma, like a rape or a sexual assault, or even just a really scary experience, it will, especially in like a car accident even, right? Or like blunt force trauma, like you fell on your vagina, right? Ouch, because that happens. Ouch. We're just gonna get some giggles in because it's heavy stuff, right? So when we have like traumas like that, it sits in the nervous system. And I really like this cemented for me when I read Naomi Wolf's book, Vagina, a New Biography. And she talked about there were refugee camps, and then there were refugee camps for people who had been raped. And the refugee camps, there was a level of like resiliency that was not there in the rape victims. The rape victims had more of this like just sort of like dead in their soul, dead in their eyes, like different levels of depression and stuff like that. And when I read that, I really was like, oh, maybe my last 10 years of depression have a cause. Let me go look at this, right? Like, and it really caused me to do some more inner digging, and studying the vagus nerve was like part of that. Was like, oh, right. And it's because the vagus nerve is that like central nerve channel. It innervates and comes all through that pelvic bowl. It attaches at the cervix, right? So if we have a birth trauma where something, vaginal exams, you're like, why are vaginal exams so challenging in a birth setting? It's because there's like an external anxious force touching to your central nervous system, physically touching it. And you're like, of course, that's destabilizing to your capacity to be relaxed and feel safe. Not to mention, when else in life do we let random strangers put their hands in our vaginas and feel our cervixes? Like never. Mostly just birth. That's the most normal place for the most common, let's say common, not normal, right? But it's the most common place where that would happen. And so the experience of like that central nervous system and that vagus nerve being disrupted through like I think of it as like a soul shutdown to like be able to handle the experience of being like violated in that way. It's like the body like shuts down and goes into disassociation to go like, this isn't happening, I'll get through this, or whatever the words or the variety of that is, like that freeze that we were talking about. And so then you have to undo that. And regardless of whether the steam actually touches the cervix or not, like we talked about, it touches all those external pieces, including the clitoris, which is, innervated and part of that vagus nerve, like matrix. So then we're able to relax and bring like calmness back to the central nervous system, which is the most common thing that I hear from people when they talk about steaming, unless they've got the water too hot and then they go, this is really hot, am I okay? And I go like, this is not an endurance sport, get off the pot, honey. Like because women need that reminder, because some of them are like, I can handle it, and you're like, just get off the pot and come back in like 3 minutes once it's steamed a little bit. But
you don't need your shower to be scalding to get clean.
No, exactly. I had to learn that when I like went through the period analysis and was like, I don't get to do super hot steams. I have to do mild steams. That's lame. Like I want to do hot, like I like sauna. I want it hot. I want it as hot as I can get it, right? And it's like, no, just gentle, just kind. And I go like, oh, what a lesson in softening, right? And it's such a feminine practice. But the thing I hear from people the most is like, oh, that was so relaxing in such a gentle way. And you're like, yeah, That's because in the gentlest way possible, your body is being, stimulated to understand it's safe. It's like people do, Kimberly Ann Johnson, right? She talks about doing like hands-on, hands-in, like vaginal healing work as part of the journey, and other practitioners too, of like healing that like tear and scar tissue type stuff. But I think a lot of women aren't actually ready for that. And so steaming is a really beautiful entry point where you don't have to touch the body. It's like, for me, my entry point to healing my sexual wounding was energy. It wasn't physical touch. That scared the crap out of me, right? It was like just like being like, hey, I can feel you and I can feel my hips at the same time. Isn't that fascinating? We're like energetic beings together, right? Like that was the level where it felt safe and okay to start. And I think steaming is that for a lot of people because it touches in that vagus nerve, central nervous system. So I love to hear your thoughts on that. That was a good little.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for explaining that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so you said, again, like I'm not a student of the nervous system for whatever reason. I always hear about it. I've actually have read about it. For some reason, it just never sticks, but it makes so much sense to me every time somebody explains it, right? Because if you said it's that the vagus nerve ties into the clitoris, and the cervix, that makes so much sense, why people have that calm afterwards. Because it's like, I think like, well, I'll give some of the anecdotal evidence, of the cervix just in general. Sometimes people steam and immediately after steaming, they'll see brown discharge come out. Well, brown discharge is old blood, right? So if somebody steams and then old blood comes out, that means that number one, they had old blood sitting in their uterus, and number two, the steam opened up that cervix so that old blood could come out, right? So that's an anecdotal, that's like kind of like that, that observation that lets us know, and that the steaming is perhaps, actually opening that cervix. So if that cervix also is connected, through to the vagus nerve and can help like with that, releasing of that tension, I mean, that makes so much sense. Mm-hmm. And then the clitoris, which you don't even have to get inside, to be able to stimulate, right? Yeah, that makes so much sense. That is, one of the, like I educate about the benefits of steaming, of pelvic steaming, far and wide, and like I don't talk about that a lot actually. It's just like at the end of the day, like I'm just trying to explain like, okay, this has benefit, and scientifically and medically this can make sense, and kind of like and here are the different things that it can help with. But like as you said, when people try it, like when you do it, it really is just like you feel so good afterward. Like imagine you had never had a hot bath in your entire life, and then you had a hot bath. To me, that's the feeling of steaming for my and vagina and cervix and uterus, like those are getting that like for the first time, and you feel it, like you feel it to the core, just this like deep calm and relaxation after, and I think that's, I don't know scientifically, is there any scientific way to measure like the impact on the vagus nerve? I don't know, but like
heart rate variability, maybe.
What would it be?
Like your heart rate variability, maybe, or like some of that heart math stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we had that in the postpartum. We did a study, the 4th trimester vaginal steam study, and we saw that the heart rate and the blood pressure of our steam group had come down compared to our non-steam group. Postpartum, their heart rate and blood pressure was going up, whereas our non-steam group's heart rate and blood pressure were coming down. Wow. So if that's a measure of that, then you have some indicator there. But I also think that there's also perhaps an oxytocin release that is happening with steaming, because I don't know, studies are crazy. I was reading this study where they were stimulating the inside, the vaginal canal of mice, And they were also
They do the weirdest things to mice.
I know, it's so weird.
This is somebody's job.
What?
Paid research positions. Anyway, I like stories. I like stories, women's real life stories, right? But tell this story too, because there's a reason you wanted to share it.
I feel you. That's why I preface it like that. Okay. Then they did another one where they were stimulating the cervix, just the cervix. And what they found was in both cases that these mice had, I think it was over 200, 300% higher rate of oxytocin release as a result of the stimulation. So if the same is true for humans, if stimulation in the vaginal canal and the cervix, if that stimulation causes oxytocin release, then that also helps to explain that like that calm afterwards, or that, you know, the oxytocin is known as the love hormone. But like when you think about it, it can make you very sleepy. It can enhance sexual experiences. It can enhance breast milk supply. And I don't know if you've had any experiences with that, but I definitely used to notice, oh, it's steam. And then my breast milk would fill up, you know, like there's kind of like all these things that happen that kind of point to that oxytocin as well, you know?
For sure. Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned on the breastfeeding piece. I had one burning, really like strong question that I really wanted to ask you about. And didn't think we were go on the whole steamy study your vagina thing, but apparently it's really important for us to talk about. So I'm glad we did that. But I really wanted to get your thoughts on sort of that first year postpartum, because it is such a, you know, it's such an interesting period of time in terms of breastfeeding, in terms of uncertainty around conception. And I know that you definitely say like steaming during the mid part of our pregnancy, like towards the end, if you feel comfortable with it, if you're ready for the baby to come, that's one thing. But during the middle of the pregnancy, say like, not a good idea. But then, and I'd love to hear just in your own words right now, like why not during pregnancy? And then we'll get into like the postpartum steaming and my question about that.
Yeah. So steaming, you know, it opens, and we do there's some anecdotal evidence that it opens up the cervix. So during pregnancy, it's really important that the cervix is closed. That's why there's no menstruation during that time and so forth. Like everything is closed up and tight, and you want to keep the baby in and keep the baby safe. So steaming before the baby is full term, you know, could cause risk of, you know, premature birth.
Right.
So, so when you're full term, when somebody's full term and they're ready for the baby to come out, then steaming can happen, but we do a very mild form of steaming at that point. And I have an online class that, birth givers can take themselves, or you can ask, your team, if you have a doula or, midwife, you can ask your team if they do steaming. And so anyways, we do a really mild form of steaming, like 5 to 10 minutes, really, really not very hot at all, but it helps to prep the body. So your question, So
my question is, in that first year postpartum, have you had stories or wisdom from like the traditions around using steaming as a form of conscious herbal pregnancy prevention? Or, they go like, oh, people say like, don't do sauna because you'll get too hot and that'll like kill the baby. And I go like, well, but if that's what you were trying to do, like, and we use steaming in, like we can utilize steaming in the abortion care as well. So it's like, I was just wondering, I was like, is that a tool? Is there documentation or anecdotal stuff around utilizing that way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we have enough information about it in general. I think that we're just starting to get the tools to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Like postpartum, right? Like people say that they start their period immediately postpartum, even when they're exclusively breastfeeding and doing a lot of body contact. Why? Like what's the difference there? Then people, start their period and then it goes away and they start it again. And then you've got people who get pregnant before their period comes, right? We've got like all these different situations that, we've got people who get pregnant during menstruation, right? Like, like there's all these things that are anomalies, that don't make sense. And I don't think that they're actual anomalies or that they don't make sense. I think we actually just don't have enough information about how we are analyzing what's going on with women's bodies. So for example, any bleeding that occurs is considered a period. Well, just because somebody's bleeding doesn't mean that they're on their period. So a lot of times you hear in the postpartum, and this is related to fertility, right? Because if you're, when you come to, you have to, that cycle.
That's what we're looking for.
That cycle is pretty measurable as far as how to get pregnant. But then when you're in this postpartum, you're just really in this uncertain point, time period. And I just got to validate that it's definitely a period of uncertainty, but like, for example, sometimes people say, oh, well, my period returned. And then it's missing again for 3 or 4 months. And you really look at what's going on. I don't think sometimes it's not their actual period that returned, because a period happens every 4 weeks. It also has an ovulation that goes with it, right?
Yeah.
Which that might have actually just been some uterine bleeding, like some abnormal uterine bleeding that occurred, which we don't really have. I don't think very many people have any knowledge that it's possible, right? Like, I mean, because people go, like, sometimes there are people who are on their period, they've been bleeding every day for like a year, right? And they talk to their doctors about it, and sometimes they're dismissed. It's like, oh, well, sometimes that, or you might be menopause, like it could be any, like, I mean, even postpartum, there are people who will go bleeding. Oh my gosh, I'm working with somebody who's like 18 months postpartum, and she's been bleeding every day since she gave birth. Right now.
Yeah.
Like, and this is just a situation that exists. And so it's, so it's tricky, so has her period returned or has it not returned? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, this is like, we also have to take into consideration that there's some uterine fatigue bleeding going on. And, can she get pregnant? Can she not? Like, I'm not sure, like it's going to be, there's going to be some level of uncertainty.
Yeah. And your wisdom around like uterine fatigue was just like mind blowing to me, that sometimes those short periods aren't actually short periods. It's just the body, the uterine artery is so exhausted that it actually just can't keep shut, because women are so depleted because they're living in this man's world and they're running their tails off all the time and they're running on adrenaline for the last 17 years or whatever, right? And it's like, we don't actually know what oxytocin is in our bodies, which is actually supposed to be like our predominant like woman hormone, just like being chillaxed and having a good time and feeling really connected to each other. But like that idea of uterine fatigue, because I redid your you've got that's in the postpartum course, I think, or the postpartum mini course. And I redid that when I was in postpartum and had some bleeding and was like, oh shit, like, I just need to relax. I just need to like rest some more. And that the stories about those ladies who were like still bleeding every day. And you're like, that's not what's supposed to be happening.
Yeah.
But it is what's happening for some people.
Yeah, like when somebody says, oh, okay, I started I'm on day 10 of bleeding or day 14 of bleeding, what you'll find is that they're traveling, or there's something stressful going on, or they just lost their job, or they just are getting out of a relationship and trying to figure it out. Like, there's something big going on that is causing them not to get enough rest, and their body is exhausted. And so their uterine blood vessels cannot close, and so they're bleeding. Right. And so it's not actually still their period. This isn't like, a period doesn't last 14 days. It doesn't need 14 days for what is supposed to happen during the period. Right. And so I think like postpartum is just, it's fascinating to me. And I have a lot of questions around it, just like you do, because I think that if we use, some of these concepts, that concept of uterine fatigue bleeding comes through from, traditional Asian medicine, but I adapted the language, in English. But like, if we use some of these concepts and we now start to observe what's going on and some of the different situations that would happen that are unexpected and, so forth, now I think we can start to understand it a little bit differently. Like, for example, like, I train practitioners to look at and to screen for early period return versus uterine fatigue bleeding. It may be an early period return. Some people's periods legitimately return early, but a lot of times it might be uterine fatigue. So we want to look at those two and figure out which one it is. Uterine fatigue responds to rest. So if you rest, then the bleeding stops, right? And so like somebody who spots every day of their period, of their cycle, they're usually dealing with uterine fatigue bleeding, and then they rest and they learn how to properly rejuvenate during the period and rest their uterus during the period. They don't have that anymore, right? Yeah. So you know if it's uterine fatigue bleeding, ultimately, like you don't know when you have the bleeding, it's like, oh, is this a period or is this uterine fatigue bleeding? You don't know until you know, but then you will find out.
I was in that I don't know. I was like, this is so weird. Am I okay?
A cycle will occur for the most part every 4 weeks, and there's also an ovulation that occurs. That's what a cycle is. You know what I mean? Like that's a period, you know, but just any bleeding doesn't mean that it's a period, you know, and we're sadly functioning with that fallacy, you know. So
and a period won't necessarily respond to herbal first aid, right? You talk about herbal first aid in your course.
Yeah, you
right?
can't stop a period.
You can't stop a period that's coming. But if it's uterine bleeding, you can drink some tea and it'll go away.
Yeah, in fact, you can, if it's uterine fatigue bleeding, if you can have somebody steam with hemostatic herbs and the bleeding will stop and go away and not come back. Mm-hmm. If it's just somebody has like if it's just somebody's period, the period will still come. Like, you know, like even if they steamed with hemostatic herbs, it's not going to stop their actual period from coming because their uterus is on that cycle, you know. Yeah. So there's different, but sometimes you only know after the fact. Like you ultimately have to see what's going on and take it case by case. And so I think we're starting to gain knowledge now, like people like you who know, okay, like you've got this concept, we're thinking about it, we're analyzing, was this uterine fatigue bleeding or actual just a period? And now we can start to gather more information. Yeah. So let's get to your question though.
Thank you. But also
overall,
super good.
Steaming improves fertility and it increases somebody's likelihood of getting pregnant. And there's kind of like not really anything you can do to prevent that. The steaming is beneficial. So you might be steaming for that scar tissue, you know, like, or whatever you're still dealing with. But ultimately, the steaming is going to increase the chances of fertility and improve, you know, the uterus, you know, it's ultimately it makes the uterus just super healthy all the time. It's improving that circulation. It's giving that uterus that circulation. That uterus is just, it's just ready to go. If you're in the childbearing years, you're going to be ready, you know, and that's what people say when they steam is like, goodness, you know, they get pregnant, right? Yeah. Trying or not trying, thinking about it, not thinking. Like when people steam, the more people steam, like pregnancy comes, you know, faster and easier. And I think that whether or not you're trying to get pregnant. So when you're not trying to get pregnant, I think that what's important is the knowing like what like fertile cycle is and being able to, you know, like use, you know, the right planning at the right time and the right, you know, contraception at the right time. If you're just using natural planning, I find that the steaming was good for me, like, in being able to prevent pregnancy because it made my cycles so regular and my ovulation so regular. So in that way, I think it's helpful. Right. But in the postpartum, when it's just like, who knows? Like, because people get pregnant, they can ovulate before they menstruate, right? So you could be at 9 months, ovulate, get pregnant before you ever menstruate again, right? So that's where that uncertainty.
That's what happened to me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's what happens. Like ultimately, postpartum it's a tricky time period. I think the only thing that maybe, and I hadn't really thought about this until you're asking me, but like maybe during that period of uncertainty when you know where the cycle, you know, hasn't returned yet, or you don't know if it's regular again or not, I think you might be able to steam post insemination. So if semen has entered, you can do a steam immediately after to just clear out that semen. Right. I think that
gonna maybe help bring it down. The heat might sort of offset the sperm in a funny way, but
bring it down and out and immediately after, you know, I think steaming, I think it's great to have it in the bedroom, you know, like, I mean, in the household, you know, and after, after insemination, the woman should be able to do that steam, just as somebody might, you know, urinate after or shower, you know, like do a steam session after if you're especially if you're in an uncertain period. So I have to say I was really good at like, planning. I was really good at it when I was steaming and before I had my first baby. But yeah, that postpartum was a doozy. That postpartum will get you. You just don't know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure. Okay. So the what I'm hearing is like generally steaming is going to increase your chances of being fertile, which is not a bad thing if you want more babies, but also that sort of like old adage of like, if you don't want to get pregnant, don't put semen inside of you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I would say. And
especially if you're not sure where your cycle's at, right?
After a certain amount of time postpartum, like when your cycle comes back, if you've had 3 regular periods, then and they're 28, 29, or 30 days, then you can assume that you're ovulating halfway through the 14 or 15, which is when you get, that's a real healthy cycle. That's a very fertile cycle. So when you've had 3 periods and your cycle is that length, now you can again reliably use your planning, natural planning in order to avoid pregnancy. But if you haven't had those 3 regular cycles, if you maybe had 2 and then it went away again, or then you had another, the reason why it goes away is because of the blood deficiency. Like your body is producing so much blood your body produced a lot of blood for the pregnancy and for the nursing, and we don't have proper postpartum care, and we're starting to get it. There's starting to be a lot more, education around the importance of that postpartum care. But so a lot of times, and then there might be like things like dieting and stuff like that, and these kinds of things impact,
weight
the
loss,
blood.
exercise. Let's get my waist back. You want to get your waist back, like steam and do some belly binding. Don't go work out. Like the baby will eat all that weight
off. It, won't it? Yeah. You will get the job done. Yeah. But anyways,
while you lie around.
So there's all these different things that are happening, right? And so again, people say, oh, well, your periods are irregular for a while afterwards. Well, did you get your period back and then start dieting? Well, then that wasn't a question mark why it went away. It went away because of blood deficiency. If your body doesn't have enough blood from not eating enough, and your body is already dealing with a blood deficiency like situation, which postpartum you are, then your period will go missing again, right? So again, this is where it's just like we need to collect some more information here, about like all the kind of different things that can happen in scenarios. But yeah, steaming is gonna make you more fertile. Clearly, because as you mentioned, that's what happened in your case.
For sure. So. But I will say that I definitely did observe. I had some what I would call breakthrough bleeding or uterine fatigue around visits from my parents and less breastfeeding, right? So that's that's actually pretty clear. And then it was I am seeing return of beginnings of cervical fluid that was fertile. But because it had been so long since I'd cycled, I was still and postpartum and just a little baby brained, right? It's what's going, it took a while to be that's what's going on. And then it's also been a while since I've really been desiring of my partner. So it's you want to roll with that, right? But that's nature's plan to get you more babies, right? So, but I would say that there was definitely I did observe there was but people, they talk about, everybody's body's different, right? But when they talk about fertile quality cervical mucus, for some people that's they can stretch their fingers 2 inches apart and it goes, and I mine never gets that, but I get pregnant. So right, it's your body and knowing what your version of fertile cervical mucus is because when I think back on it, I go oh yeah, that was actually, it was pretty clear, but like you said, it's sometimes not clear until after the fact, right? Was it a period? Was it breakthrough bleeding? It's well, it was a period because we've had 3 in a row and it's pretty regular. But if it was once and then not again for 4 months, it's oh, that was probably depletion. And you talked about blood depletion, which is another really mind-boggling, fabulous concept that you brought into my world, which is this idea that we build, so they talk about, what is it? There's a thing that it's not preeclampsia. It's they use the brewer's diet to fix it at the end of pregnancy. It's you basically have low blood volume because like your blood is like feeding the baby and you're not getting enough protein in your diet. So then you add more protein, more nutrition, and like your blood volume can go up and you stop feeling crappy. I can't remember the name of the medical condition right now, but more or less. And it's like, then you're pumping the baby out, right? So a bunch of your shared blood is going into the baby, and then a bunch of, sometimes you lose blood during the actual birth process, right? Like it's fairly normal to lose an amount of blood during that. So then rebuilding that blood in that postpartum period is super important. And, we're doing like nourishing herbal infusions, we're doing high protein foods to help, again, build that blood volume up. But if people aren't doing that and they're breastfeeding and they're having these challenges, this is what happened to me with my first, like I was just absolutely overdrawn and malnourished basically, which caused postpartum depression that took a long time for me to heal until I started doing like nutritional therapy basically, which is why I'm so into this with my second, because it took me like 7 years to get my head back out of my ass after birth, right? Like I was really young and I had no idea what was going on. And so then for my second, I was like, I will not make those mistakes. I will educate myself and we will do it differently, right? Which is part of why the podcast, so that other people don't have to, they can just listen to some stories and make changes in their lives, right? But that place of like, their period isn't coming back. Maybe they're trying to get pregnant, right? So we're coming back full circle. It's like they're trying to get pregnant, but they're not getting pregnant with that second baby that they really want 2 or 3 or 4 years apart. It's been 5 years and they're really struggling with fertility. And it's like steaming is, again, really beneficial there because we can nourish with the herbs directly to the site. We're improving the circulation. And then also some people, if they've never done steaming, they might still have pregnancy matter in there. 45 years later, right? 15 years later, you talk about like ladies having really challenging menopauses, and you're like, yeah, you still got like little, you haven't had a proper full like uterine cleanse since you had your babies 15 years ago. And like, you can't, and then the things that resolve after doing like a proper 30-day like steaming process or 40-day steaming process, it's like incredible, the stories and just people's transformations. It's really incredible. And especially if they're trying to get pregnant again, it's like you can't get, well, probably you can get pregnant really depleted, but it's like much trickier, right? Just like you said, like,
well, you could end up with issues. The goal isn't to get pregnant. The goal is to have a healthy pregnancy.
Right. Yeah.
So if you don't have enough nutrients to nourish yourself enough to have a period, if your body doesn't have enough blood to have a period, when you're pregnant, your body needs to produce now twice as much blood. So it's not a good situation for the baby. It's not a good situation for a pregnancy. That's where you see like a baby might stop developing after a certain amount of time. Or
midterm losses, right?
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Or like you continue to miscarry, and it's like this really opened my eyes too. It's like you're continuing to miscarry because there's potentially still pregnancy matter from one or more of those miscarriages in your womb. And like, you can't grow a new healthy placenta with like parts of an old baby in there. And then like, not only, right? Like, but like not only physically, but also like energetically, spiritually, right? So we were talking about like steaming your rapists out. It's like you can also like steam your old babies out physically and emotionally and energetically through like engaging in a 30-day steam practice where you go like, we just got to clean this out. It's like trying to start a new project in my garage, right? Which is just like, it's just like you can't even walk from one side of this thing to the other. How are you gonna like build a beautiful house in it or build a little whatever? It doesn't work.
What's so interesting is that you and me and anybody else who's taken that postpartum steam class, become a postpartum steam practitioner, understands this. You guys, like, for the listeners out here, people steam 5 years postpartum and then pregnancy matter comes out. That's why she keeps on saying it. It's insane. I had somebody, like the first
old,
case
stringy, dark blood, big clots, like chunks of
amniotic
things.
sacs, like placentas, like it is insane. And this can be whether or not they did a DNC, this can be whether or not for post miscarriage or whatever it might have been. this can be whether or not they took, the medical pills, or whatever, post miscarriage. And then this could also be postpartum. Yeah. Some people never heal postpartum. And I've started to use, like on my intake form, I actually updated it, Elena, so I'm not sure when you saw it last, but I added like that we can add an evaluation at the end that this is incomplete postpartum recovery. If, there are certain signs that there has never been a full postpartum recovery, and like we need to define what postpartum recovery is, and also be able to call it when people have an incomplete postpartum recovery. And what I think that we're dealing with, if you look at all of the women all over the world, I think we are dealing with like a lot of women who are still, like have not fully recovered postpartum.
Absolutely.
And when people start steaming and they've already had their children, some of the stuff that comes out is just insane, and this is like, no wonder there's been depression. No wonder there's been hormonal imbalance, right? Like, no wonder there's been like, menstrual, issues, right? It can go either way. Sometimes people, have great periods, and then afterwards, after postpartum, now they have these horrible periods, heavy bleeding, clots, all this stuff. There was never a full uterine cleanse postpartum, which is something that needs to happen postpartum. And so that's why you have now this ongoing situation. And it's so funny how we know it. Those of us who have done it ourselves and then done it with others, especially when you're looking at those people where, they're too far to still be dealing with these issues. And then you see that crazy stuff clear out. Like, it's insane. It's really, I think it's just a real clear sign of how underserved we women currently are by our health care system. Because you've produced a result. Look, this matter has now come out, right? This isn't like, we feel like you're not respecting us enough. Well, that's that happens. Subjective.
It's subjective, this is but also universal.
Right. Objectively, this was negligence.
Yeah.
This 6-week checkup that is supposed to happen doesn't even check to make sure that the uterus was cleared out, at least not in the United States.
No.
And therefore, and because of that, women are not recovering postpartum. There's not even a definition for postpartum recovery in the medical books. No. So there's either not getting a full recovery, and they're ultimately now dealing with the repercussions of that and the side effects of not having a full postpartum uterine cleanse. And it's insane.
Yeah.
Do you want to hear something crazy though?
Yes.
I just learned the other day that in the Ukraine, they do ultrasounds like 5 days postpartum to see if the uterus has cleared out all the way. And then, since the uterus is never really cleared out at 5 days postpartum, here's what I have to say about that. That makes sense to me that somebody would be monitoring to make sure that the uterus gets cleared out all the way. Now, as far as the day that they have it on day 5, I feel like that's a little bit early, because what they do is they say your uterus isn't cleared out all the way, and then they do a DNC. So
first of all, day 5, you should still be at home resting and like nursing and bonding with your baby.
Yeah.
Right. And so then not getting an ultrasound.
So the postpartum steam therapist, like us, in our crowd, is now helping women use the steaming for but so at least they know, because I don't feel like over here in this part of the world we even know what's supposed to be happening postpartum, because it's not like
no people don't been trained by Rachel Garcia in Innate or some other like fabulous traditional midwife. Like, no, it's like, hey, I'm going out for coffee with the other postpartum ladies on 2 weeks postpartum.
Like, I don't even know if our doctors know. The fact that at the 6-week checkup, it's just about giving birth control and saying that you can return to sex. Like, I'm not sure that they even know what
they ask. Are you having vaginal pain? Did you have tearing? Like, how's your experience of moving around? How's your poops? Like, how are you still bleeding? Like none of those questions.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of significant things that could be even happening at that 6-week checkup if we were just going to deduce it and only have a 6-week checkup, which we do only have that. But like, still, there's more significant things that should be happening. So I thought it was fascinating to see that they're actually actively involved in making sure that the uterus is cleared out. But then I thought it was just classic male care. to do it at day 5, and
when
then
like clearly you're still
go
bleeding.
in and scrape her clean. Like you're using tools.
Your body does
metal
that
tools
naturally over the next, like over that 40 days or 2 to 6 weeks, right? Like that's what the lochia is. It goes like, let's just make sure everything's cleaned out. And if you steam while you're doing that, it's like, yeah, for sure. If you do 40 days of steaming, everything's gonna be out. Like, and it's just, it's so boggling to me that like that first 6 weeks is so precious, and it's such a like tender time of bonding, and that there's like, some people spend that going to practitioners and they spend it. I mean, I did like the 40-day lay-in. It was fucking fabulous. I would absolutely recommend it for everybody. And it's made me like such a transformed, able to receive sort of woman. It was excruciating at some points to like continue asking and continue to receive. And I remember on day like 7 looking at my mom and being like, I have how many more days of this? I can't. My partner's like, just think of it as like a meditation retreat. This is what you wanted to do. And I go like, I hate it. Can I just like get up and do things? And then I like go lift the peanut butter jar and be like, I can feel that in my pelvic floor. Like, let's put that back on the shelf and ask somebody else to do it. You know, like it was really humbling to be so in tune with my body and to rest so much, because I really hadn't since the birth of my first, like 10 to 12 years earlier. But it's like that 6 weeks is so precious, and we can engage alternative practitioners. We can steam, we can belly bind, we can massage, we can get in-home massage instead of going to a practitioner, right? Like, and that way we can nurse the baby in the middle of the massage if we really need to. You could get a massage while nursing. Did you know this? It's like totally fine. But no, we'll do car seats and like drive, and like bad, like the cars seats, the adult seats are at like such bad angles for the pelvic in general. And she's like, oh, but we could just, such simple tools, right? Like they're simple traditional tools that like actually don't take a lot of time or money. You can set up a crock pot with a little stool, like cut a hole in a chair, or like build a really simple box, and or buy one of your like many beautiful stools that you have on your site, and like sit on it and just have it running, just have it on all the time postpartum. And then when you have that 5 minutes, you just sit on it and you go like, oh, thank God, 5 minutes to myself. So good. Maybe I'll shower next time, but this is actually more rejuvenating than a shower. So thank God it's here, you know? And then you go, oh, the baby needs me. You're like, I don't want to get up yet. I'll just nurse for a little bit while I sit on the steam a little bit longer, you know? And it's like, oh, and I'm healing my labia and my uterus, and I'm helping make sure that like I don't have postpartum depression while I do it. And it's just this like little like 2 square feet of corner in the corner of the room that happens to make the whole room warmer, which helps with that like freeze cold thing we were talking about. It's just like,
and what else? I tell you, what else? Like, this is the thing. I you know, for the listeners, I want them to understand. I think like you know, I first steamed in 2011, and there was not, you couldn't type in vaginal steam on the internet. Like there was zero, like like you could there's few things you can type in where you get 0 results. This was one of them. Yeah. And I know, because I tried it in 2011. I was like, oh, well, there's no information there, you know? But now I think like more people know about it, but I think it's really understanding that doing it at the spa, or doing it at a red tent circle somewhere, you know, like once, is different than what happens when working with a steam therapist for postpartum.
Yeah.
So I think labor, you know, to anybody listening, understand labor is pretty simple. Like, you know, if you can work with a steam practitioner from 36 weeks in it, you know, you can just get, they can just let you know that you're safe, not contraindicated, and give you some, you know, some setup, and then you can be good, you know. But postpartum, we actually, like, you know, my class is extensive. We work with people, and first of all, we have a definition for postpartum recovery, all the things that need to happen postpartum, right?
Fabulous checklist.
Plans and so forth.
Yeah.
And we work with people over the first 30 days daily. We're doing daily check-ins and might be changing the herbs. Somebody might be contraindicated, or they might be able to steam depending, you know, on the day, because it changes. Like how you said, sometimes, you know, relatives come and then that causes now some heavier bleeding, and you might have to stop that day. Yeah. But you can start again that next day, right? And it's beneficial to do it at that time. But if you're not going to be working with a steam therapist, then you do have to pause until until the lochia, the discharge turns brown or stops. But it's really beneficial to get it in immediately. And you want to work with somebody either on your birth team who is trained in steaming for postpartum, or a traditional birth keeper. The traditional midwives still have this knowledge and know when it's safe to and not to. Or you find somebody like you, who, or, checked out the directory. There are people, these practitioners, they work with people virtually. They can call in, they can send intake forms, and then they can help to guide you even if they're not there. And we are trained, my postpartum steam therapists are trained to work with people over those first 30 days. We might change the herbs 2 or 3 times, depending on what the needs are, in order to get everything that you need healed up. And then, during 1 month to 12 months, we're able to, if there's any uterine bleeding, we're able to help that bleeding go away. If the period returns too soon, it's not the period, but it's usually uterine bleeding, or even determine whether it's the period or some fatigue bleeding, right? We work with people during that time period, and then we work with people when that menstrual cycle returns, to be able to make sure that it's a healthy return, because you don't actually know if somebody had a full uterine cleanse until they have that period afterward, their first menstrual return. And so we're trained to work, I train the practitioners to work with people through 3 healthy menstrual cycles. If there's been 3 healthy that's how long we work with people. So we work with people from postpartum all the way through 2 years, right? And in order to make sure that somebody's life gets on track, in the right way. Like, you shouldn't be postpartum and then your period comes back in 5 months later, and now you deal with 10-day long heavy bleeds with clots. That's one of the options of what happens to people postpartum. Or now you have horrible cramps and you never did before. All of those are signs that there wasn't full postpartum recovery. So I just want people to understand that wherever you are in postpartum, it'll still be beneficial to work with a practitioner, because that is, no matter what, even if you're 5 years postpartum or 20, work with a practitioner, because it's really important to do after every birth. But even like during that postpartum time period, if you're within that 1 or 2 years, seek out a trained practitioner who can really help you get right on track, because we are trained to actually work with the menstrual cycle. And so we work with people through the menstrual cycle return and make sure that there's a healthy menstrual cycle return. So, and then there's different herbs the first 30 days, there's different herbs, in that waiting period for the period to return. And then there's different herbs when the period returns based on what that period looks like. That's how we're trained. And I don't know, it's really hard to explain this. I think there's right now a lot of doulas, a lot of other birth workers who are I've steamed before, and then think that that's just, that they can now just steam their postpartum clients, and they can, and that's beneficial in a way, but there's also some things to really be aware of, and that there can be heavy bleeding postpartum, and steaming stimulates bleeding. And we know, and we are trained in those signs when somebody can't steam. And we're also, I think it's really important for postpartum steam therapists to have first aid to stop bleeding in-house. So we get it, whether you're working virtually or there, you have it with you, or you've made sure that the client has it, because steaming, because postpartum bleeding is something that happens regardless of steaming, but steaming stimulates blood, right? It makes it fast, circulation. So we do have to know what we're doing, and also know what to expect. One of the things that might happen if a bunch of clots come out afterwards, or if cramping happens, do we stop steaming or do we start steaming? And how do we analyze that? We go through this, we go from case studies and we think through each one of these different scenarios, and we know what we're doing, So I just encourage the listeners to reach out to Elena here. You all got a treasure resource here, who is a fully trained postpartum steam therapist in your community. Definitely get that consultation, even if just one consultation. And I don't know if she's offering them. She seems very busy with the family and everything. But
I do them here and there,
Or she can refer you, or you can go to steamychick.com, find that practitioner map. I have it says find a practitioner, and you can find a practitioner anywhere. I think over 1,100 people are trained now, and So people can find, these practitioners, and steaming is like, even in places where steaming is still commonplace, where it wasn't interrupted by the medical system or by a patriarchal medical system like we have, there's always this measure of, the in-house steaming, like steaming is safe. People don't need a practitioner just to do steaming for general health. Once a month after the period, you just steam for your well-being, and people know enough to do that. But then there's the situations where you need a practitioner to come in, where you need somebody who's an expert, and so postpartum is one of those cases.
Because it's more complex, like we were talking about the resumption of fertility. It's like, it's so complex. And I think it's really important to have a continuous caregiver, right? Like so many people, it's like they don't even know who if they're doing hospital birth, they don't even know who's delivering their baby. If you arrange somebody who's gonna like go through and help you prepare for your steaming before you give birth, and then check in with you 30 days in that postpartum, and then check in with you the next month and the next month for until your period comes back at 3 healthy cycles. It's like, I actually cried when I got to that part of the course, because it's just like, God, we need that. Like, we just need somebody to like, just keep checking in, as opposed to like, oh yeah, you're good. 6 weeks, bye-bye, see you never, like I needed that. I want to offer that to people, where it's like, oh, we can just like continue. And that's part of, I've been running an online moms group, like it was weekly for a bit, now we're doing bi-weekly, for almost 2 years now. And it's like, some of those people are getting pregnant again for the second time. And we're all just still walking with each other in that. And it's just like, oh, we need that continuity of care, even if that care is like quasi-professional. It's like people caring about each other is so important.
So important.
Yeah. And it's like, I took your course, and I was like, oh yeah, I have the information, but I still sought out a practitioner to sort of like be able to bounce. I go like, I think I know what I'm doing for my postpartum steaming, but like, can I just check in with you? And it was so beautiful to have her check in with me and guide me through that process. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. And then the last thing, because we talked about a lot of postpartum, or like maternity issues, or
reproductive continuum.
I'm doing the same thing. Uses of it. The other thing to know is that it could be used for first aid, like in different situations. So people use it in the case of retained placenta when they're doing home births. This is an incredible tool for retained placenta. Retained urine. After giving birth, you have to be able to make a bowel movement. This helps people make bowel movements. like there's all these things that happen, or there's all these first aid uses for it, that are really important, to know about. And so I truly believe that steaming should be in every labor and delivery room. Oh, sorry, it can help in case of a stalled labor. It can help in case that somebody has an active labor, for some reason the cervix isn't opening. It's helped in all of these cases. We see this, and it can really sometimes make the difference between the need for intervention or not. And ultimately, those are the things that keep the mother and the baby safe, right? And so it's I really do think it should be in every labor and delivery room and every postpartum setting, as well as the option to have that expert help, I think is really important as well.
Well, and that's why the work that you've said over 1,000 practitioners that you've trained through your online course, and it's just like, and one of the things I picked up from that was it was used universally postpartum. Steaming was used universally postpartum. It was in every culture's labor and delivery plans. And it's just the crazy Western patriarchal medical system that's like been like, oh, this is too useful of a tool. Let's just like cut this out, right? Like, it solves too many problems. We can't monetize hot water,
Jeez.
I mean, and you've like proved a little bit differently as well, right? Like it can be, and it can also just be used like effectively at home by individual people, right? And so just the sense of like it was used universally, and that's what you and I, through like having this conversation and sharing the podcast, like that's what we're trying to bring back, is go like, this can be a universal practice again. And you're probably spending your life working on that, right? Like that is why you're on Earth.
we got cut off from this knowledge, and it's just weird. It's just like if people forgot how to brush their hair or something, like it's just a strange thing that happened, and it happened. It's interesting. I actually want to write like maybe a paper on like how vaginal steaming got lost, but like, it honestly there was like a very sudden change from women's health and women's matters. Was just women took care of it. So there were female physicians, and I mean, we can call them midwives now, but there were female physicians throughout the whole entire world, and it wasn't even considered part of medicine. And then Spain passed a law that it was illegal to give any medical care unless somebody was a medical doctor and they had a degree in it, that they had gone to a university and got that degree. Well, at that time, women weren't in universities. So no female physicians were MDs, right? They were doctors, they were female physicians, they weren't MDs. And then all of the countries in Europe passed similar laws, and this was during the colonial era, and they took those laws all throughout the world. So now, and then the next thing that happened was that, they took a woman to trial and were like, she delivered a baby. Was this medical care or not? And they determined it was. So now all of a sudden, all women delivering babies were doing something illegal. And so medical doctors who were all men at the time started attending to women. They didn't know what the vagina looked like. They didn't know how to deliver babies. They didn't know what needed to happen postpartum. That's the starting point for the current gynecology that we have. They like put the woman on the table so we could see what's going on, right? I don't know. I was in a hospital. My friend was giving birth, and the doctor was sitting at the back like this, just looking at the table, just, between her legs. Like that's why she's on the table, is so that the doctor can see it. This wasn't how women were giving birth. So what we have is all of the knowledge up until about the 1600s of women's health and how women need to be taken care of. And then what we've got is what has been happening for the past 400 years. And there's just a vast difference between this. And so the medicine that was developed, that is what our current gynecology is, was the starting point without any continuity. There was no continuity between the care that happened prior. Yeah. And so we just have
the male doctors didn't even study with the midwives. They were just like, we'll just make this up. We'll uncover our own thing.
They didn't know what to do, and they started using surgery. So, for example, they didn't think that the baby could come out of that small hole, so they started doing episiotomies. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this stuff came about due to lack of knowledge, Yeah. And so we developed a form of women's medicine, which is the predominant form of women's medicine right now in the world, that is based on surgery and pharmaceuticals. Now, both of these things save lives. Both of these things have use. They're also very narrow, and were developed in a very specific context where women were property at that time, where women didn't have rights. And so you still, I think that's like kind of like what our generation is really grappling with when we go to the doctor. Like, how come all of our gynecologists are like old men? And how come like they freaked out when I asked them a question? And how come, like, you know what I mean? Like, we're actually really still dealing with a situation where, again, even European women were considered property, but then the grandfather of gynecology, who really took the field, to a further place, was in the 1800s, was a slave owner who was operating on his enslaved women. Yeah. So it's just like, we have a real dark and like pretty it's really kind of crazy how our gynecology developed. And so that's where it's like, I don't like, doctors they don't even know it exists till now. They don't even know it exists, right? Like, so even if you have a very well-meaning doctor who wants to help their patients, which is the case, like all of my friends who went to med school, is like, they want to help people, they don't even have a context for learning about some of the stuff that was like this modern gynecological system that we have. And the stuff would be very useful. We need it. Like, people like you and me are bringing some of the stuff back, like the wrapping and the, and the, just what the laying in, that taking that time to rest, and the steaming, but there's a whole bunch of things. And ultimately, I think it's important for people to understand that just because it didn't stop being used because it wasn't useful. It stopped being used because women were suppressed in medicine, suppressed, oppressed, arrested, and even killed,
burned at the stake.
Yeah. So that's where the knowledge got lost.
Yeah. And it wasn't lost, it was intentionally suppressed, right? Like
women were, for sure.
Yeah.
Like it was like women. And that's why we have to know, okay, we live in a man's world. And that's why we have a very male-dominated form of medicine that is given to us. And that's fine. We can still use those tools if they're necessary or if they're useful. I think ultrasound is a really cool, incredible like technology that we have, and so forth, right? I think there are useful things. I do think that surgical birth, can save lives in very specific situations. But we just knowing the way that this form of medicine developed is just really useful for us to be able to make our decisions, about the care that we deserve, are going to get, and whether or not we're only going to receive the care that happens at the medical office. Like ultimately, we kind of need to supplement what's going on there.
Oh yeah, and I listened to a podcast recently with Sister Morningstar, and she said prenatal care is how you live your life while you're pregnant. Everything you do, how you wake up, how you care for your body, who you hang out with, how you let your vibe be, like the stress levels that you're impacted with, all of that is your prenatal care. We have prenatal checkups where we're weighed and measured, but that is not necessarily care.
Yeah.
Right. And so
I'm okay with it.
And so it's like we have a responsibility as birthing women to set the standard for what our care looks like. And I would really encourage people to have that be like self-oriented, self-educated, like finding beautiful women practitioners that like and trust, who are willing to listen to your questions and answer your questions and think about your concerns and have, responses. Because the midwifery community has been co-opted by that Western medical and the insurance complex as well. Like that is also, we could, right? And other people have gone into that in big ways. Like Indie Birth has a really fabulous, the history of midwifery course that's available that talks about how, like what you touched on, like all of those pieces of like what happened in the 1600s and why this happened. And it's a lot of it's about control, and a lot of it's about like how women operated in the world, because if you can control birth, you can control how it's a rite of passage. How we go through that impacts everything that happens to us afterwards. And so if we go through that as a helpless victim who needs support and analysis and testing, and we buy into all of that, and like I have very strong opinions about this, like everybody gets to have their own opinion and they get to be wherever on that spectrum they want to be. I happen to be over on the like wild birthing, like free birthing side of the like F the system sort of side of the spectrum, but that needs air too, right? Because there's a lot of not that in the world. Everybody gets to choose where they want to be on that spectrum, and like good on you. But
so in other words, everybody except Elena, okay? Like she makes her own choices, you get to make your own. What she's doing. Yeah. I respect it.
Yeah. And it's like we need to choose like what do we want and what feels like care, right? Because some of that midwifery feels like bullying. We've helped a number of people in our group quit their midwives because they're like, I need to come to this group to process how bullied I feel and how gaslit I feel by interacting with my like Western medical midwives. And it's heartbreaking to me, because actually birth is like a supernatural, it's like literally supernatural, as in like we touched other realms, but it's also,
ooh, yes.
I'm not that witty. That was just like life talking through me. But it's like, it's also like, it's a supernatural, it's very natural phenomenon that is like built into our bodies, and the animal body understands birth better than anybody who's only taken 4 years of training or 15 years of training even to like study it, because that animal body has hundreds of thousands of years. And even if you're a creationist, it has several thousand years of working in this way and birthing, we're here because our ancestresses had big enough hips to birth. We're here because they were well supported and they had tools like steaming and like all these other, like resting, like being cared for by other women, right? Like they had these tools, and unfortunately a lot of women don't have those tools available to them, but you can absolutely educate yourself and you can absolutely build that support network around you. And that can be the work of like prenatal care, is like build the support network, educate yourself, like re-empower yourself, extricate yourself from that system, go through that rite of passage the way you want to, not the way everybody says you need to be feared to, right? Like,
yeah.
So I got a lot of like woof about that, but like,
no, it's so important that we design this. We design, we go back, people like you and I are, figuring out what got lost and reintroducing it and figuring it out. And part of that is a little bit awkward and a little bit clumsy, and we end up being, so radical, and it can be very isolating, and again, but what you're doing is great. You build your support networks, you know what I mean, like, and you do it because you deserve it, you know what I mean, like, and all women deserve it, but it's what people like you are doing, which is gonna make it the new normal, or it's gonna create better systems for somebody who is, like you said, you were a young mom, what about that 19-year-old who's gonna go through this and is not gonna take all these classes and not gonna read all these books and not think about historically how gynecology has, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, we need to create systems so that this just is commonplace, whether or not somebody is an intellectual radical, who's gonna redesign, like, like the care that we deserve or not. Like,
yeah,
the passive moms should just be getting this too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that is one day.
It's gonna happen.
I'll keep doing what I'm doing.
I don't know what happens when we women talk. Like, I think, like, ultimately, when you think about steaming, when it hit the media, it didn't hit it in a very positive light. It still is not positive, and yet there's no stopping it. It's growing like nobody's business. It's spreading like wildfire because it's meeting a need that wasn't met elsewhere, right? And honestly, like, the way it spreads is through these conversations, which is so funny to me. I'm like, oh, don't tell like 10 women know about something. I'm like, a year later, 100,000 women are gonna know it because like we talk,
Yeah.
Whether it's our Facebook groups or what, we will get the word out there about this.
Yeah. Oh, so beautiful. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours. And
I know
I would love to jam. I'm sure there's things that I would love to talk to you about even more. But I need to get back to my kid and my family and all that. Yours are older, but mine is really little and I'm pushing it.
I know.
So before we wrap up, I just want to check in. I'll put the links in the show notes to some of the things we talked about, like the 4th trimester vaginal steam study, which is fabulous. But where can people reach out to you? Like, what's the best way for them to connect with you and engage with steaming?
Yeah, I'm at steamychick.com and on Instagram at Steamy Chick. Those are the 2 best places to find me. And I really encourage everybody to reach out and find a practitioner. People like Elena are just excellent out here, experienced doing this work. And ultimately, it's an underutilized resource, like we have this knowledge and this experience, and, we're here to make sure that women have access to this. So, it's us that does it, spread the word, to everybody. And I would just say, keep on listening to this podcast. Clearly, Elena is here to spread this truth, you know what I mean? And to make sure that we know what we're missing.
Yeah, indeed. Well, because I went through hell with my first.
I know.
It was hellish for a long time, and like I love him and he was a beautiful wake-up call, but when I went to go do it again, I was like, I gotta do this differently. I gotta figure it out. And so yeah, the podcast is a collection of that wisdom. It's a collection of all the things I wish I had done differently the first time, and talking to practitioners like yourself who are experts in their field in women's health and alternative healing therapies and solving things and in different ways, in ways that are simpler and more natural and easier to apply, and where you can like learn it and then you can just do it, you know? Yeah, super beautiful. So Keli, this has been like such a, I feel like,
Well, I don't want to stop. I don't want to stop talking to you, but we got to stop. We got to just call it quits.
Yeah. Well, and you're welcome to come join the our moms group anytime. A bunch of the ladies were like, "You're interviewing Keli?" And I was like, "Yeah."
Oh, fun.
So, you know, we had considered having them on here during the call, but I was just like, well, that's a lot for me to manage. But if you wanted to come and give a talk specifically to our group of ladies, like, we would love that. So
okay, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end.
How easily can you imagine that this experience is integrated already deeply into every cell of your being in such a way that you will begin to notice that you have already been operating from this new behavior for a while, and that it was simply a matter of noticing how much you've already been doing this. You may choose to feel that this moment is the moment that completely and utterly into your body. Or in the days and weeks ahead, getting curious about how fully and completely this experience has transformed your life, realizing that you are at complete choice to choose how you would like to integrate this information into every cell of your being.
Thank you so much for being a part of the Joygasmic Life podcast, and I am so grateful to have you here and be a part of it. If you haven't already, head over to joygasm.me to check out our Joygasmic Birth Blueprint ebook and course, which give you all of the information that you need to become a Joygasmic mama, whether you are postpartum or whether you're expecting your first baby. This course absolutely has tips and tricks for you that will help prepare you for birth, prepare you for the birth of your next child, and prepare you for peaceful and joygasmic mothering on the other side. So absolutely, the way that we do one thing is the way that we do everything. And so by utilizing and beginning to build a practice of joygasmic alchemy, you will absolutely become a better mother and hold space, as I am and as many, many women are, for the enlightenment of the planet. We do that first by working on ourselves and then offering that support and that enlightened nature within ourselves to our families. And then from there, it ripples out. So if you haven't already checked that out, go check that out now. Again, it's joygasm.me. We've also got courses on rescuing your relationship, bulletproof mom, how to be able to handle even the most intense toddler or special needs child later on in life, as well as a multitude of new courses that are coming out. We're absolutely grateful to get to have you as a part of that. And remember, anyone who participates in the funding of the podcast absolutely gets a membership access, which allows you to access the bonus features, the ends of some of our episodes, exercises from our guests, as well as featured free content from them. So super glad to have all of you who are a part of that already here. And thank you so much for being a part of the Joygasmic Life family. If I could leave you with only one tip for how to be an orgasmic, joygasmic mama in this world, the invite would be to really step into and embody the knowledge that you are actually here for a reason, and that reason is to be an enlightened being for your family. They chose you for a reason. They chose you on this consciousness journey for a reason, and you absolutely have the tools and skills to be able to do this. If you're struggling, please reach out. I am more than happy to help people rewire what's going on in their brain, create a new story, and create a more powerful experience so you can be the kind of mama for your kids that you really have dreamed of. You absolutely deserve it, and your children absolutely deserve it. I look forward to getting to know you more, and I look forward to co-creating through the membership content. Have a beautiful day, and we'll see you on the next podcast.